Sarah Chen sat in the corner booth of Murphy's Tavern, nursing her second beer of the evening. The dim lighting cast shadows across her weathered hands as she watched the Friday night crowd through tired eyes. At 34, she carried herself with the kind of stillness that made people forget she was there. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore faded jeans with a plain black sweater that had seen better days. The bar buzzed with the usual mix of office workers celebrating the end of another weekend, college students getting an early start on their weekend. Sarah preferred it this way, anonymous in the crowd, just another face in the background. She had been coming to Murphy's for 3 months now, ever since moving to the small coastal town of Millbrook. The bartender, Mike, knew her drink order but nothing else about her. That's exactly how she wanted it. Another round for the lady in the corner? Mike called out, but Sarah shook her head. She was about to leave when the door chimed, announcing new arrivals. 3 men in expensive suits walked in, their voices already loud with alcohol from somewhere else. They scanned the room with the kind of confidence that came from money and privilege. The leader of the group was tall and broad-shouldered, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a watch that probably cost more than most people made in a year. His name was Bradley Whitmore III, though most people in town knew him simply as Brad. His family owned half the businesses in Millbrook, including the marina and several restaurants along the waterfront. Behind him walked his 2 usual companions, Marcus Reed, a lawyer who handled the Whitmore family's business affairs, and Tony Castellano, whose father ran the largest construction company in 3 counties. Together, they formed an unofficial boys' club that had ruled Millbrook's social scene since high school. "Look at this place," Brad said loudly enough for half the bar to hear. "Same old faces, same old losers drowning their sorrows." His eyes swept the room dismissively until they landed on Sarah. Something in his expression shifted, a predatory gleam that she had seen before in other places, other times. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on her beer, hoping they would move past her table to claim their usual spot near the pool tables. But Brad whispered something to his friends, and all 3 men began walking in her direction. She could feel their approach like a change in atmospheric pressure. Well, Brad said, sliding uninvited into the booth across from her. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Brad Whitmore. This is my town, and I make it my business to know everyone who passes through." Sarah looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with calm brown eyes. "I'm just having a drink," she said quietly. "Not looking for company." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the ambient noise of the bar. "Hear that, Brad? She's not looking for company. That's rich, considering she's been sitting alone in here every Friday night for months." "Maybe she's been waiting for the right kind of company," Tony added, his voice carrying an undertone that made several nearby patrons glance over nervously. Sarah's grip on her beer bottle tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained level. "I said I'm not interested. Please leave me alone." Brad leaned forward, his smile never wavering but his eyes growing colder. "You know, sweetheart, that's not how things work around here. See, my family has deep roots in this community. We look out for people, make sure everyone feels welcome. But we also expect a certain level of respect." The conversation at nearby tables had begun to quiet as people sensed the tension building. Mike the bartender looked up from washing glasses, his weathered face creasing with concern. He had seen Brad and his friends cause trouble before, but usually they targeted other men in arguments over sports or politics. This felt different. "I haven't disrespected anyone," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge that made Brad's smile falter slightly. "I paid for my drinks, I haven't bothered anyone, and I was about to leave." "Were you now?" Brad's hand shot out across the table, not quite touching her arm but close enough to be threatening. "That would be a shame. We were just getting acquainted." Sarah's eyes moved from his hand to his face, and something in her expression made Marcus shift uncomfortably in his seat. There was a quality to her stillness that reminded him of a coiled spring, though he couldn't have explained why the thought occurred to him. "You should move your hand," Sarah said simply. Brad laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Or what? You'll call the police?" "Lady, in case you haven't figured it out yet, I am the police in this town." My family funds half the department, and the other half owes us favors going back decades. The truth of this statement hung heavy in the air. Everyone in Millbrook knew the Whitmore influence extended into every corner of local government. Brad's uncle sat on the town council, his cousin was the fire chief, and his college roommate had recently been elected district attorney. Sarah took a slow sip of her beer, never breaking eye contact with Brad. "I don't need the police," she said quietly. Something in those 5 words made the hair on the back of Tony's neck stand up. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood before his father's business took off, and he recognized the sound of someone who knew how to handle themselves. But Brad was too drunk on his own power to notice the warning signs. "Tough girl, huh?" Brad reached across the table again, this time wrapping his fingers around Sarah's wrist. "I like that. Shows spirit. But everyone in this town learns eventually that cooperation makes life a lot easier." The moment his hand made contact with her skin, Sarah's entire demeanor changed. The quiet resignation disappeared, replaced by alertness so sharp it was almost visible. Her free hand moved slowly to rest on the table, fingers spread in what looked like a casual gesture but positioned for instant action. "Last chance," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Let go." Brad's grip tightened instead. "See, that's where you're wrong about chances. In my town, I decide who gets chances and who doesn't. And, right now, I'm deciding you need to learn some manners." The bar had gone almost completely quiet now. Even the jukebox seemed to sense the tension and had fallen silent between songs. Mike reached for the phone behind the bar but hesitated, knowing that calling the police would likely just bring more of Brad's friends. Sarah looked down at Brad's hand on her wrist, then back up to his face. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, still quiet, but with an undertone of absolute certainty that made several people in the surrounding area take an unconscious step back. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," she said conversationally. "Before that, I spent 2 years in specialized training that most people couldn't survive for 2 weeks. I learned 17 different ways to disable someone without leaving marks, and about 40 ways that do leave marks." Brad's smile wavered slightly, but his grip didn't loosen. Big talk from someone drinking alone on a Friday night. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his point. "You know what the hardest part about coming home was? Learning to dial back the responses. In the field, when someone grabbed you without permission, you didn't negotiate. You didn't give warnings. You eliminated the threat efficiently and moved on." Marcus was definitely feeling nervous now. There was something about the way Sarah spoke, calm, measured, almost clinical, that suggested she wasn't making empty threats. "Brad, maybe we should just shut up, Marcus," Brad snapped, but some of his confidence was cracking. "Little Miss Military thinks she can intimidate us with war stories." Sarah's free hand moved slightly on the table, a gesture so small most people missed it, but Tony caught it. He had seen enough street fights to recognize someone shifting their weight for action. "Brad," he said urgently, "maybe we should go check out that new place downtown." But Brad was in too deep now, his pride demanding that he maintain control of the situation. In his world, backing down from a woman, especially one sitting alone in his family's territory, would be seen as weakness. "I think our new friend needs a lesson in how we do things in Millbrook. Maybe a ride to somewhere quiet where we can have a proper conversation." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Around the bar, people were making quick decisions about whether to get involved or pretend they hadn't heard anything. Mike's hand hovered over the phone, but years of living under Whitmore influence made him hesitate. Sarah looked around the room slowly, taking in the faces of everyone watching. Some showed concern, others fear, but most displayed the resigned acceptance of people who had learned not to challenge the local power structure. When her gaze returned to Brad, there was something different in her eyes. A decision had been made. "You have 5 seconds to let go of my arm," she said quietly. "After that, I stop being polite." Brad laughed, but it sounded forced now. 5 seconds? What are you going to do, scream for help? Throw your beer at me? Face it, sweetheart, you're out of your league here. 5, Sarah said, her voice completely calm. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered, but he made no move to leave. 4. Tony was definitely ready to bolt now. Every instinct he had was screaming that this situation was about to go very wrong, very fast. Brad, seriously, let's just go. 3. Brad's grip tightened further, his knuckles going white. You think you can intimidate me? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? 2. The bar was so quiet now that the sound of someone's nervous breathing was audible from 3 tables away. Mike had his hand on the phone but still hadn't picked it up. A few of the smarter patrons were quietly moving toward the exit. 1. Brad opened his mouth to say something else, but never got the chance. What happened next would be discussed in Millbrook for years to come, growing in the telling until it became the stuff of local legend. Sarah's movement was so fast that most people missed exactly how it happened. One moment Brad was gripping her wrist and leaning forward with his trademark arrogant smile. The next moment he was on his back on the floor, gasping for air, with Sarah standing over him in a position that suggested she could do significantly more damage if she chose to. The transition had been so smooth, so professionally executed, that it took several seconds for the full bar to process what they had just witnessed. Tony jumped back so fast he knocked over his chair. Marcus's mouth fell open in shock. And Brad, for the first time in his privileged life, found himself looking up at someone with the absolute certainty that he was completely outmatched. Sarah looked down at him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire confrontation. I tried to be polite, she said simply. But some people only understand one language. She stepped back, giving Brad room to get up, but her posture made it clear she was ready for whatever came next. Around the bar, people were pulling out their phones, some calling friends, others recording video. The story was already beginning to spread. Brad struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and fury. His expensive suit was wrinkled and his perfectly styled hair was disheveled. But, more than his appearance, his aura of invincibility had been shattered in front of half the town. You have no idea what you've just done, he said, his voice shaking with rage. No idea who you're messing with. My family has been running this town for 3 generations. Sarah picked up her beer and took a sip, as calm as if nothing had happened. Your family doesn't run me, she said simply. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Whitmore name represented in Millbrook. For decades, no one had dared to stand up to them so directly, so publicly. And certainly no one had ever put Brad on his back in front of an audience. Marcus was frantically whispering in Brad's ear, probably suggesting they cut their losses and leave. Tony had already backed toward the door. But Brad's pride wouldn't let him walk away from such a public humiliation. This isn't over, he said, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. Not even close to over. You think you're tough? Wait until you see what real power looks like in this town. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I've seen real power, she said quietly. This isn't it. The dismissal in her voice was like a physical blow. Brad's face went from red to purple, and, for a moment it looked like he might try to physically attack her again. But something in Sarah's stance, the way she balanced on the balls of her feet, the slight shift in her shoulders, suggested that would be a very poor decision. Mike finally found his voice from behind the bar. Maybe everyone should call it a night, he suggested weakly. Brad looked around the room, taking in all the staring faces, the phones recording, the whispered conversations already beginning. His humiliation was complete and public, witnessed by people who would spread the story throughout Millbrook before sunrise. Come on, Marcus said urgently, tugging at Brad's arm. We're leaving. For a moment, Brad looked like he might refuse. But, even through his rage, some part of him recognized that staying would only make things worse. He straightened his jacket with exaggerated dignity and walked toward the door, his friends trailing behind him. At the entrance, he turned back for one final attempt to regain some authority. Enjoy tonight, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Because tomorrow, you'll learn what happens to people who make enemies of the wrong family. Sarah didn't even look up from her beer. Promises, promises, she said quietly, but somehow her voice carried to every corner of the now silent bar. After the 3 men left, the atmosphere in Murphy's Tavern slowly began to return to normal. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the jukebox started playing again. But everyone knew they had just witnessed something significant, a crack in the foundation of how power worked in their small town. Mike walked over to Sarah's table, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "That was something," he said carefully. But Brad wasn't kidding about his family's influence. "You might want to watch yourself." Sarah looked up at him with tired eyes. "I've been watching myself for a long time," she said. "It's become a habit." She finished her beer, left money on the table, and walked toward the door. As she passed other tables, she caught fragments of whispered conversations, speculation about who she was, where she had learned to fight like that, and what would happen next. Outside in the cool evening air, Sarah paused on the sidewalk and looked up at the stars barely visible through the town's light pollution. She had come to Millbrook hoping for peace, for anonymity, for a chance to blend into the background and heal from wounds that didn't show on the surface. Instead, she had just painted a target on her back by humiliating the most powerful family in town. She knew Brad's type, privileged, vindictive, and unused to being challenged. He wouldn't let this go easily. But, as she walked toward her small apartment above the used bookstore on Main Street, Sarah wasn't afraid. She had faced worse enemies in darker places with higher stakes. Brad Whitmore and his family were about to learn that some people couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and couldn't be pushed around. The quiet woman they had tried to grab had spent years in places where weakness meant death and strength was the only currency that mattered. Now they would discover exactly what kind of person they had chosen to make their enemy. Behind her, Murphy's Tavern continued to buzz with conversation about what everyone was already calling the night the Whitmores met their match. But, for Sarah, it was just Friday night in a small town where she was trying to build a new life. The real test would come tomorrow, when Brad had time to plan his revenge and bring the full weight of his family's power to bear. Sarah had no illusions about the fight ahead. It would be dirty, personal, and probably public. But she had fought worse battles and won. And, this time, she wasn't fighting for her country or her unit or some abstract principle. This time, she was fighting for the right to exist peacefully in a place she was trying to call home. The war for Millbrook was about to begin, and Sarah Chen was ready for whatever came next. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling in Millbrook, the kind of weather that matched the town's collective mood. News of the previous night's confrontation at Murphy's Tavern had spread through the community like wildfire, carried by text messages, social media posts, and excited phone calls that started before dawn. Sarah woke in her small apartment above Turning Pages, the used bookstore she had rented from Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a 70-year-old widow who had owned the shop for 30 years. The apartment was sparse but clean: a bed, a dresser, a small table with 2 chairs, and walls lined with bookshelves that Mrs. Vance had left behind when she moved to the smaller unit next door. The sound of raised voices from the street below drew Sarah to her window. A small crowd had gathered outside the bookstore, and she recognized several faces from Murphy's the night before. Some were pointing up at her apartment, others were taking pictures with their phones. The story was apparently more interesting in daylight than it had been under the dim bar lights. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. Thought you should see this." Sarah opened her laptop and found a message from Mike containing links to 3 local news websites, 2 Facebook groups, and a YouTube video titled "Mystery Woman Destroys Brad Whitmore in Bar Fight." The video had been posted by someone called Millbrook Watcher and already had over 2,000 views. The coverage was surprisingly detailed for such a small town. The Millbrook Daily Herald's website featured a front-page story with the headline "Altercation at Local Tavern Leaves Questions About Newcomer's Identity." The article was carefully worded to avoid legal issues, but it painted a clear picture of Brad's humiliation. More concerning was a blog post on the Whitmore Construction Company website titled "Protecting Our Community Values." It didn't mention Sarah by name, but it talked about outside agitators and individuals who don't understand our way of life. The message was clear enough. A knock at her door interrupted her reading. Sarah looked through the peephole to see Mrs. Vance standing in the hallway, holding a tray with coffee and what looked like homemade muffins. "Good morning, dear," the elderly woman said when Sarah opened the door. "I thought you might need some breakfast after all the excitement." Mrs. Vance was barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and bright blue eyes that missed nothing. She had been the first person in Millbrook to show Sarah genuine kindness, renting her the apartment without requiring references and asking no questions about her past. "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting the tray. "You didn't have to do this." "Oh, I think I did," Mrs. Vance replied, inviting herself into the apartment. She walked to the window and looked down at the crowd below. Word travels fast in a small town. Faster when it involves the Whitmores. Sarah poured coffee from the thermal carafe and offered a cup to Mrs. Vance. "I suppose you've heard all about last night." "Heard about it?" Mrs. Vance laughed, a surprisingly sharp sound. "Dear, I've been waiting 40 years for someone to put that boy in his place. His grandfather was bad enough, his father was worse, and Bradley turned entitlement into an art form." This wasn't the response Sarah had expected. Most people in town seem to either fear the Whitmores or depend on them for their livelihoods. "You don't seem concerned about the consequences." Mrs. Vance sat down at the small table and fixed Sarah with a steady gaze. "Let me tell you something about consequences. In 1985, my husband Frank refused to sell this building to Whitmore Sr. They wanted to tear it down and build another one of their strip malls. Frank said no, so they had the city inspector find code violations that would have cost us $50,000 to fix. What happened? Frank was a veteran too. Korea. He knew something about fighting when the odds weren't in your favor." Mrs. Vance smiled grimly. "Turned out those code violations disappeared real quick when Frank reminded the inspector about some photographs he had from the inspector's bachelor party." Sarah was beginning to understand that Millbrook's power structure was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. How many other people have had problems with the Whitmores? More than you might think. They're careful to spread their pressure around, make sure no one feels strong enough to fight back. Pick off the weak ones, compromise the strong ones, buy off the smart ones. It's worked for decades. Until now. Mrs. Vance leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that might have been anticipation. "Until now. See, they made a mistake with you. They assumed you were like everyone else who drifts through Millbrook, down on your luck, looking for a place to hide, easy to push around. How do you know I'm not?" "Because I was watching from my window when you walked down Main Street the first day you came to town. I saw how you moved, how you looked at buildings and people. That's not how someone broken moves. That's how someone trained moves." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and considering how much to reveal. Mrs. Vance waited patiently, the kind of person who understood that some stories couldn't be rushed. "I was in the Navy," Sarah finally said. "Special operations. 3 tours overseas." Mrs. Vance nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. "And now you're here, trying to figure out what comes after the war." "Something like that." "Well, it looks like the war followed you to Millbrook." Mrs. Vance gestured toward the window where the crowd below was growing larger. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Millbrook Police Department. "Ms. Chen?" The voice on the other end was professionally polite but carried an undertone of reluctance. "This is Sergeant Martinez with the Millbrook Police. I'm calling about an incident last night at Murphy's Tavern." "What about it?" "Well, we've received a complaint about an alleged assault. I was wondering if you might be available to come down to the station and give us your statement." Sarah glanced at Mrs. Vance, who was listening with obvious interest. "What kind of complaint?" "I'd prefer to discuss that in person, if you don't mind. Are you available this morning?" After agreeing to meet in an hour, Sarah hung up and found Mrs. Vance shaking her head with disgust. "They work fast," the older woman said. "Brad probably called his cousin Jimmy first thing this morning. Jimmy Martinez is a decent enough man, but he's got 3 kids and a mortgage. Whitmore money helped him get through the police academy. So this is how it starts. This is how it always starts. They used the system against you: police complaints, building inspections, tax audits, zoning violations. Death by 1,000 small cuts. Most people give up and leave town rather than fight it. Sarah finished her coffee and stood up. I'm not most people. Mrs. Vance's smile was fierce and proud. No, dear, I don't think you are. The Millbrook Police Station was a small brick building on Elm Street, built in the 1950s and showing its age. Sarah arrived exactly on time and was shown into a cramped interview room by Sergeant Martinez, a stocky man in his 40s with tired eyes and the posture of someone carrying more weight than he wanted. Thank you for coming in, Martinez said, settling into the chair across from her. This shouldn't take long. We just need to get your side of what happened last night. My side? Martinez opened a folder and consulted some papers. According to the complaint filed this morning, you physically assaulted Bradley Whitmore without provocation at approximately 10:30 last night. Mr. Whitmore claims he was attempting to have a friendly conversation when you attacked him. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Martinez's face. She could see the discomfort there, a man trying to do his job while knowing he was being used as a tool in someone else's game. That's an interesting version of events, she said carefully. What exactly is Mr. Whitmore claiming I did to him? He says you threw him to the ground and threatened him with violence. There were approximately 30 witnesses. And what do the witnesses say? Martinez's discomfort increased visibly. We're still collecting statements. Sarah nodded slowly. Sergeant, can I ask you something? How long have you been a police officer? 15 years. 8 here in Millbrook. In 15 years, how many times have you arrested someone for defending themselves against unwanted physical contact? Martinez was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Ms. Chen, why don't you tell me what happened from your perspective? Sarah told the story simply and factually: Brad's unwelcome approach, his escalating threats, his physical grab of her wrist, and her measured response to defend herself. She spoke in the clear, precise language of someone who had written many incident reports. So you're claiming self-defense, Martinez said when she finished. I'm not claiming anything. I'm stating what happened. Mr. Whitmore grabbed me against my will after I repeatedly asked him to leave me alone. I removed myself from his grasp using minimal necessary force. Any of the 30 witnesses you mentioned can confirm this. Martinez made some notes, his pen moving reluctantly across the paper. Mr. Whitmore says he was only trying to welcome you to the community. Is grabbing someone's wrist without permission considered standard welcoming protocol in Millbrook? The question hung in the air between them. Martinez closed his folder and sat back in his chair, looking directly at Sarah for the first time since the interview began. Off the record, he said quietly. Sarah nodded. Brad Whitmore is a spoiled brat who's never faced consequences for anything in his life. Half the calls we get about disturbances involve him or his friends. But he's also the mayor's nephew, the fire chief's cousin, and his family employs about a quarter of this town. And, on the record? Martinez opened the folder again. On the record, we're investigating a complaint of assault and will forward our findings to the district attorney's office for review. How long will that take? Could be weeks. Maybe months. These things sometimes drag on, especially when the case is complicated. Sarah understood the message. The process would be drawn out, designed to pressure her into leaving town rather than fighting expensive legal battles. It was probably effective against most people. Sergeant Martinez, can I ask you one more thing? Sure. In your 15 years as a police officer, how many Navy SEALs have you arrested for assault? Martinez's eyes widened slightly. Navy SEALs? I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with SEAL Team 5. I've been trained in close quarters combat, advanced tactical procedures, and threat neutralization. If I had wanted to assault Mr. Whitmore, he would have required medical attention. The statement was delivered calmly, almost conversationally, but its impact on Martinez was immediate. He looked down at his notes, then back at Sarah with new understanding. The complaint doesn't mention anything about military service, he said slowly. The complaint probably doesn't mention a lot of things. Like the fact that Mr. Whitmore was drunk, threatening, and physically aggressive with a woman who was trying to leave peacefully. Martinez was quiet for several minutes, writing additional notes. When he looked up, his expression had changed. Miss Chen, I have to follow proper procedure here. But, I want you to know that this department takes self-defense cases very seriously. We don't arrest people for protecting themselves from unwanted contact. Even when the person making the complaint has influential family connections? Even then, Martinez said firmly. The law applies to everyone equally in this town. Sarah stood to leave, recognizing both the sincerity in his voice and the difficult position he was in. Thank you for your time, Sergeant. I hope the investigation is thorough and fair. It will be, Martinez said, standing as well. And, Ms. Chen? Be careful. The Whitmores don't like to lose, and they have a long memory. Outside the police station, Sarah found the crowd from outside the bookstore had grown even larger. Word of her visit to the police had apparently spread, and now there were news vans from 2 regional television stations parked across the street. The story was expanding beyond Millbrook's borders. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: coffee at Sunrise Cafe in 1 hour. Come alone. You don't know me, but I know about the Whitmores. A friend. Sarah considered ignoring the message, but something about the wording made her curious. She had learned to trust her instincts about people and situations. This felt less like a trap and more like an opportunity for information. The Sunrise Cafe was on the opposite end of Main Street from the bookstore, a small family-owned business that served excellent coffee and homemade pastries. Sarah arrived early and chose a table in the back corner where she could see both the entrance and the back exit. She didn't have to wait long. A woman in her late 30s entered the cafe, looked around briefly, and walked directly to Sarah's table. She was professionally dressed in a dark suit, with short auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that suggested someone used to making quick assessments. Ms. Chen? I'm Jennifer Walsh. Thank you for coming. Sarah gestured to the chair across from her. Should I know who you are? Jennifer sat down and signaled the waitress for coffee. I'm an investigative journalist with the Portland Tribune. I've been working on a story about municipal corruption in coastal towns for the past 6 months. Millbrook keeps coming up in my research. What kind of corruption? The usual small-town variety. Contract fixing, selective code enforcement, intimidation of political opponents. The Whitmores are mentioned in connection with most of it, but they're careful. Nothing quite provable in court. Jennifer pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah several newspaper clippings and documents. This is just what I've found in public records. 3 businesses forced to sell to Whitmore companies after sudden regulatory problems. 2 families who left town after their teenage children were arrested on questionable charges. A city councilman who voted against a Whitmore development project and then lost his job when his employer suddenly had budget cuts. Sarah studied the documents. The pattern was clear and consistent. Anyone who opposed Whitmore interests faced swift and coordinated pressure from multiple directions. Why are you telling me this? Jennifer leaned forward, her expression intense. Because what happened last night changes everything. For the first time in decades, someone stood up to them publicly and made it stick. That story is already spreading on social media. Videos are being shared in other towns where the Whitmores have business interests. And you want to write about it. I want to write about all of it. The corruption, the intimidation, the way they've turned municipal government into their personal enforcement arm. But I need someone who's willing to go on the record, someone who can't be easily discredited or scared off. Sarah sipped her coffee while considering the offer. Going public would certainly escalate the conflict, but it might also provide protection. It was harder to make someone disappear when national media was watching. What makes you think I can't be scared off? Jennifer smiled grimly. Because I did some research after I saw the videos last night. Sarah Chen, former Navy SEAL, 3 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart. civilian life in San Diego until 8 months ago, when you suddenly sold everything and disappeared. You're not here because you're running from something, you're here because you're trying to heal from something. The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Sarah had hoped her military record would remain private, but she should have known that was impossible in the internet age. What do you want from me? An interview. On the record. Tell your side of what happened last night, but also talk about who you are and why you came to Millbrook. Give people a reason to care about what happens to you. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text, this one from Mrs. Vance. They're putting pressure on the landlords on Main Street. 3 shops got building inspections this morning. This is bigger than just you now. Looking up at Jennifer, Sarah made her decision. The Whitmores had just escalated from personal intimidation to community-wide pressure. If they wanted a war, she would give them one they wouldn't forget. When do you want to do the interview? Jennifer's smile was sharp and satisfied. How about right now? I have a camera crew waiting outside. As they walked toward the cafe entrance, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came before action. She had spent years fighting enemies who threatened innocent people. The Whitmores had just revealed themselves to be exactly that kind of enemy. The battle for Millbrook was about to go public, and Sarah was ready to take the fight to them in ways they had never experienced. They had picked a war with someone who knew how to win wars. By evening, the story would be trending on 3 social media platforms and picked up by major news networks. The quiet woman they had tried to intimidate was about to become their worst nightmare, someone with nothing left to lose and everything needed to bring them down. The interview with Jennifer Walsh aired on the evening news across 3 states, and, by Sunday morning, Millbrook found itself at the center of a media storm that nobody had anticipated. The story of a decorated Navy SEAL standing up to small-town corruption resonated far beyond the coastal community, striking a chord with viewers who had their own experiences with local power structures that seemed untouchable. Sarah woke to find satellite trucks lining Main Street and reporters from as far away as Seattle setting up equipment outside the bookstore. Her phone had received dozens of calls from news outlets, legal organizations, and veterans groups offering support. The quiet life she had sought in Millbrook was officially over. Mrs. Vance knocked on her door at 7 in the morning, carrying another tray of coffee and pastries. Well, dear, she said with obvious satisfaction, you've certainly stirred up the hornet's nest. I didn't expect it to get this big, Sarah admitted, looking out at the media circus below. Maybe not, but it needed to happen. You should see what's happening online. People are posting their own stories about the Whitmores, going back 20 years. Pictures, documents, recordings. It's like a dam burst. Sarah opened her laptop to find her email inbox flooded with messages. Veterans from across the country offering assistance. Lawyers volunteering their services. Residents of other small towns sharing similar experiences with powerful families who ruled through intimidation and corruption. But, mixed in with the support were darker messages. Anonymous threats. Warnings to leave town before something unfortunate happened. Photos of her apartment building taken from different angles, clearly meant to demonstrate that she was being watched. They're not going to give up easily, Sarah said, showing Mrs. Vance some of the threatening messages. Of course they're not. The Whitmores have too much to lose. But they're also facing something they've never dealt with before, public scrutiny. Everything they do now will be watched and recorded. As if to prove her point, Sarah's phone rang with a call from Sergeant Martinez. His voice was tense and formal. Miss Chen, we need you to come back to the station. There's been a development in your case. What kind of development? I'd rather discuss it in person. Can you be here in an hour? When Sarah arrived at the police station, she found it surrounded by news crews and protesters. Someone had organized a rally in support of her, with dozens of people holding signs reading "Justice for Veterans" and "End Corruption Now." Counter-protesters were also present, carrying signs defending the Whitmore family's contributions to the community. Inside, Martinez looked like a man under enormous pressure. His usually neat uniform was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading her to a different interview room than they had used before. "We've completed our preliminary investigation into Friday night's incident. And..." Martinez opened a thick folder filled with witness statements, photographs, and what appeared to be video stills from security cameras. "Based on our investigation, including statements from 32 witnesses and security footage from the restaurant across the street, we've determined that you acted in lawful self-defense." Sarah felt a slight tension release from her shoulders. "So no charges will be filed?" "No charges against you," Martinez said carefully. "However, we are filing charges against Bradley Whitmore for assault, harassment, and public intoxication. The district attorney's office has also opened an investigation into witness intimidation, as several people reported being pressured to change their statements." This was more than Sarah had expected. That must have taken courage, considering the family's influence. Martinez's expression was grim but determined. "Ms. Chen, I've been a police officer for 15 years. I took an oath to serve and protect all citizens equally. I won't let political pressure compromise that oath, regardless of the consequences." "What consequences?" "Mayor Whitmore, that's Brad's uncle, called for my resignation this morning. The city council is meeting in emergency session this afternoon to discuss my employment status." Sarah studied the sergeant's face, seeing the resolve there but also the very real fear of a man who might lose his livelihood for doing the right thing. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Actually, there is. The FBI has opened an investigation into civil rights violations and municipal corruption. They want to interview you about not just Friday night, but about any other interactions you've had with the Whitmores or city officials." "When?" "This afternoon. Special Agent Rebecca Torres is flying in from Portland. She specializes in public corruption cases." As Sarah left the police station, she was approached by Jennifer Walsh, who was covering the story's rapid escalation. The journalist looked excited but also concerned. "This is moving faster than anyone expected," Jennifer said. "The FBI involvement changes everything. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "What do you mean?" "Federal investigations are serious business. They'll dig into every aspect of your life, the Whitmore's business dealings, city government records going back years. People are going to be forced to choose sides in a very public way." Sarah looked around at the protesters, the media crews, the general atmosphere of a community in crisis. "This isn't what I wanted when I moved here." "But it's what was needed," Jennifer said firmly. "I've been tracking the Whitmore's activities for months. Without someone willing to stand up to them publicly, they would have continued using their power to hurt people indefinitely." That afternoon, Sarah met with Special Agent Rebecca Torres at the FBI field office in Portland, a 2-hour drive from Millbrook. Torres was a compact woman in her 40s with short gray hair and intelligent dark eyes that suggested someone who had seen enough corruption cases to recognize the real thing. "Ms. Chen, thank you for making the trip. I understand this situation has escalated quickly. That's putting it mildly." Torres opened a laptop and pulled up what appeared to be an extensive file. "We've been monitoring the Whitmore's activities for some time as part of a broader investigation into municipal corruption along the Oregon coast. Your incident Friday night provided us with the opening we needed to move forward. How long have you been investigating them?" 18 months. We have evidence of contract fixing, bribery, tax evasion, and intimidation of public officials. The challenge has been finding witnesses willing to testify. Most people in Millbrook are either afraid of retaliation or financially dependent on Whitmore businesses." Torres showed Sarah documents detailing a complex web of corruption involving construction contracts, zoning decisions, and regulatory enforcement. The scope was staggering, millions of dollars in public funds diverted to Whitmore interests over decades. "Why hasn't anyone spoken up before?" "They tried. 3 years ago, a city councilman named Robert Hayes attempted to expose irregularities in a major development contract. His house was vandalized, his daughter was arrested on drug charges that were later dropped, and his wife lost her teaching job due to budget cuts. He moved his family to California 6 months later." Sarah studied the photographs and documents Torres had compiled. What do you need from me? Your testimony about Friday night's events, obviously. But, more importantly, we need you to be visible. Your presence in Millbrook, your willingness to speak publicly, gives other victims the courage to come forward. We've already received a dozen calls from people willing to provide information. And, if I refuse? Torres leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. That's your right, of course. But, the Whitmores won't forget what happened Friday night. They'll find ways to make your life difficult whether you cooperate with us or not. At least this way, you help ensure they can't do to others what they've been doing for decades. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her options. She had come to Millbrook seeking peace, but she had found a community living under the shadow of systematic corruption. Her military training had taught her to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. What exactly are you asking me to do? Go back to Millbrook. Live your life. Document any attempts at intimidation or retaliation. And, when we're ready to move forward with arrests, be willing to testify about what you've witnessed. How long will that take? Probably several months. Federal cases move slowly, especially when they involve this level of political influence. But, Miss Chen, I want you to understand something, this investigation will succeed. We have the evidence, we have the resources, and, now we have witnesses willing to come forward. Driving back to Millbrook that evening, Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. She had enlisted in the Navy to serve her country, had fought overseas to protect American interests, and had returned home seeking only a quiet place to heal. Instead, she found herself in another kind of war, fighting a different kind of enemy on domestic soil. But, this war felt just as important as any she had fought overseas. The Whitmores represented everything she had spent her military career fighting against: the abuse of power, the oppression of the weak, the corruption of institutions meant to serve the people. When she arrived in Millbrook, she found the media circus had grown even larger. National news networks were now covering the story, framing it as a broader examination of corruption in small-town America. The protests had grown as well, with supporters coming from neighboring towns to show solidarity. Mrs. Vance was waiting in her apartment with dinner and an update on local developments. It's been quite a day, she said with obvious satisfaction. 3 city councilmen have called for Mayor Whitmore's resignation. The state attorney general's office opened their own investigation. And Brad Whitmore was arrested this afternoon on the charges Sergeant Martinez filed. Where does that leave us? At the beginning of the end, I'd say. The family's power was built on secrecy and intimidation. Now they're facing federal investigation, media scrutiny, and a community that's finally found the courage to speak up. Their reign is over, it's just a matter of how long it takes to make it official. Sarah walked to the window and looked down at the crowd that had gathered in support of her story. Many of them were veterans, drawn by the military aspect of the narrative. Others were simply residents of Millbrook who had finally found the courage to challenge the power structure that had controlled their town for decades. I never expected to become the center of something like this, she said. Mrs. Vance joined her at the window. Sometimes history chooses us rather than the other way around. You didn't ask for this fight, but you were the right person in the right place when it needed to happen. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched as the Whitmore empire began to crumble under sustained pressure from federal investigators, state authorities, and relentless media coverage. More witnesses came forward with stories of intimidation and corruption. Documents were subpoenaed. Bank accounts were frozen. Brad Whitmore was released on bail but found himself facing federal charges in addition to the local assault case. His father and uncle were indicted for conspiracy, bribery, and racketeering. The mayor resigned in disgrace, and 3 city council members were arrested for their roles in the corruption scheme. Sergeant Martinez not only kept his job but was promoted to lieutenant after his honest handling of the investigation earned praise from state and federal authorities. The city council that had threatened to fire him was itself under investigation. 6 months after that Friday night at Murphy's Tavern, Sarah sat in a federal courtroom in Portland, watching as the last of the Whitmore family members was sentenced to prison. The quiet woman who had just wanted to have a beer in peace had become the catalyst for one of the largest municipal corruption prosecutions in Oregon history. After the sentencing, Sarah drove back to Millbrook for what she expected might be her final time. She had served her purpose as a witness, the federal investigation was complete, and she was free to resume her search for a peaceful place to build a new life. But, as she walked down Main Street, she realized something had changed in her as well as in the town. The businesses were thriving under new, honest leadership. Young families were moving in as property values stabilized under legitimate governance. The community that had lived in fear was beginning to flourish. Mrs. Vance found her sitting in Murphy's Tavern, at the same corner booth where everything had started. The elderly woman sat down across from her with a knowing smile. "So," Mrs. Vance said, "are you leaving us now that the excitement is over?" Sarah looked around the tavern, noting how different the atmosphere was. People laughed freely, conversations were relaxed, and there was none of the underlying tension that had characterized her first visit. This was what a community looked like when fear was removed from the equation. "I came here looking for peace," Sarah said. "I thought that meant finding a place where nothing ever happened. And now I think peace might mean something different. Maybe it's about finding a place where you can help make good things happen." Mrs. Vance's smile widened. "The bookstore downstairs could use some help. Business has been booming since all this started. Seems people are interested in stories about ordinary folks who do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it." Sarah laughed, recognizing the irony. She had tried to escape from being someone who made a difference, only to discover that running away from who you are is impossible. The skills and values that had made her a good SEAL were the same ones that had made her effective against the Whitmores. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a home," Mrs. Vance said simply. "Millbrook needs people who won't be pushed around. And I suspect you need a place where being strong is seen as an asset rather than a liability." That evening, Sarah called Special Agent Torres to let her know she would be staying in Millbrook permanently. The agent wasn't surprised. "Good," Torres said. "We could use someone like you keeping an eye on things. Corruption has a way of creeping back when people stop paying attention." "Are you asking me to be an informant?" "I'm asking you to be yourself. Someone who doesn't tolerate injustice and isn't afraid to speak up when things go wrong. The best defense against corruption is an informed, engaged citizenry." A year later, Sarah stood behind the counter of Turning Page's bookstore, helping a customer find a book on military history. The shop had become a community gathering place, hosting book clubs, veteran support groups, and town hall meetings where residents could discuss local issues without fear of retaliation. She had never found the anonymous peace she had sought when she first came to Millbrook. Instead, she had found something better, a purpose that used all of her skills and training in service of people who needed protection from those who would abuse power. Sometimes customers would recognize her from the news coverage and ask about that night at Murphy's Tavern. Sarah would tell them the truth, that she was just a woman who had been pushed too far and had pushed back. But she also told them that the real heroes were the ordinary residents who had found the courage to speak up once someone showed them it was possible. The quiet woman who had wanted nothing more than to drink her beer in peace had discovered that true peace wasn't the absence of conflict, it was the presence of justice. And, in Millbrook, Maine, that justice had been hard-won and would be carefully protected by someone who knew its value. The bar where everything started still served beer to anyone who wanted it. But now it served it to citizens of a free community rather than subjects of a corrupt dynasty. And Sarah Chen, former Navy SEAL, had learned that the mission to protect and serve didn't end when you took off the uniform, it just found new battlefields and new ways to make a difference. Standing at the window of her bookstore, looking out at the town she had helped liberate, Sarah finally understood what home meant. It wasn't a place where nothing ever challenged you. It was a place where the challenges were worth fighting for.